My name is Tarek. Welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel.
A year or two ago, it would have been pure fantasy to pick EliGE as the best player in NA or the carry of Team Liquid even. But if you were to pick EliGE in Fantasy CSGO tournament now on esports pools, you'd have a very good chance of doing well because he's a player where he probably wouldn't be the most expensive player. There's players like Nico, Cold Zero out there, but he can put up numbers with these players and is an absolutely incredible player. EliGE is not only the best North American player right now, he is one of the very best players in the entire world at this moment and has the capacity, the ceiling, to arguably be the best NA CSGO player of all time. He is a carry unlike any that NA has seen in the years since Skadoodle's prime in the summer of 2015, AWPing for Cloud9, Hiko back in 2013 for Quantic, Complexity, what would later become Cloud9 when his lurking style was very much at the peak of its powers. You look at the storyline of EliGE's career, and it really is this gradual ramp up. You know, he was a player who was inconsistent, unproven, had to gradually work his way up, find his identity. But when he finally has, he has activated all of his skills and seemingly to an extremely high level. Back in 2015, he was just an unproven, inconsistent player. He was mainly an onliner. When he got to the offline tournaments, he looked hesitant. He looked indecisive. He looked like a player who was afraid, who had nerve issues, who tilted if anything went wrong at all. He was in a team that wasn't very powerful, that had names who later on would go on to be good, and a mixture of players who were past their sell-by date or would never be anyone at that point in time. They very much were a lesser team who just happened to have been put in a position to represent a bigger organization. But by the time you got to 2016, EliGE was already starting to blossom. Already, he was a player where his play was having a massive effect on his teammates' play. He really was part of what allowed Nitro to hit his peak. Hiko was in the team still as an experienced role player, but as a key experienced element. They got Simple into the lineup. The problem is, as EliGE managed to blossom, his personality issues were brought to the forefront in a way they hadn't been in the past team. Now he had tilt issues. Now he had fractious relationships with members of his team, with teammates who he was playing with people he did want to play with, people who didn't want to play with, the direction he saw within the team. 2017 came along, and the guy was just locked in. By the time 2017 arrived, this guy was the best player in Team Liquid, he was the best player in NA, and he was already set to become one of the best players in the world. It's just his team wasn't ready to elevate him to the status of playing later in tournaments again, where there you can really prove that you're not just a good player, you're one of the world's entire best. He has been the carry of Team Liquid since Simple's departure, from Cologne onwards last year, from 2 majors ago. Him and Simple in that decider against Fnatic at the major, that really for me was like the birthplace of EliGE as this true carry, because it was the two of them who got it done in that Fnatic series against an incredibly skilled, very, very dangerous team to play against. Arguably the most difficult in terms of trying to go up head to head in terms of raw skill at the time. They were so experienced, they were so talented, they played so well off each other, and they came to play in that match. They did not just fall apart like Na'Vi did in the decider on Cobblestone in the round before, in the quarterfinals. Fnatic really brought it, and it took next level play from, yes, Simple, he was in godlike form, but EliGE was right there with him for most of those periods of time, and especially for that second map, if you remember correctly. Now, essentially, from Cologne onwards, the only tournament that EliGE has had that you could legitimately say was a poor tournament, was below his standards, was just an average to not that good tournament, was ironically at DreamHack Austin in NA. And obviously, traditionally, NA players perform better in NA and better at NA tournaments and smaller tournaments. EliGE has performed at the highest level in huge majors, going deep in majors, in playoffs. He's done it all. So this is a guy where you want to talk about monster performances that he's had offline. You can start listing them off for him already, and you can see this guy's already compiled what's going to become a legendary career. So go back to ESL 1 Cologne 2016, the 9th CSGO major. So against Fnatic, as pointed out, in the semi-finals of a major, in a best-of-3 series, this guy was going off against one of the most skilled teams, arguably the most skilled team in the world, and one of the all-time great teams. You had the Na'Vi series in both the Swiss system and then in the semi-finals of ESL 1 New York. Again, a best of 3, a very, very skilled team again. That team actually went on to win ESL 1 New York. He was still putting up fantastic numbers against them. Skip forward to IEM Oakland, when yes, Team Liquid was a little bit less powerful as a team. They didn't have Simple anymore. They also didn't have ESO and York. They had Pimp instead. They were still working out the whole situation in terms of the coaching. But against G2, one of the more skilled teams of the year, featuring arguably the best duo of the year in Sox and Scream, he went off against those guys. Then you go to the ELEAGUE Major, the 10th CSGO Major. Go against teams like Envious, Flipside, Mouse Sports. These teams all at times ranked top 10 in Europe. All teams with quality players, historically great players at times. All teams with experience playing in majors and big tournaments. This guy was the man against these. He was going off. He couldn't be stopped. You go to CS Summit this year. NIP, yes, now a fallen team. They had Draken in the lineup, admittedly not the lineup that had won titles, but still veterans. Forrest and Get Right, some of the best players of all time. Players who even late last year, 2016, were winning MVP awards. Some of the best players out there in the scene, top 10 players. A best of 3 against these guys. He takes care of business. He's the best player on the server. You come to ECS Season 3. Forgetting, by the way, about EPL, where obviously he didn't have to play against the most elite level competition to get as far as he did, but he took care of business there against whoever they put against him, mainly lower top 10 teams and the likes of Envious, etc., who are kind of has-beens. But you come to ECS Season 3, he's dominating, the best player by far in the server in a best of 3 series against Fnatic. He's the main carry against the Olofmeisters, Flushers, JW, Crims of the world, Dennis, the Monster on Pistorons. Then he goes into the next series, another best of 3 against Astralis, and he's the best player in the server again, despite the fact Astralis are the reigning major champions, despite the fact Astralis can never be stopped prior to the top 4 of a tournament, and yet he's going off. He's putting his team in position to potentially beat out that team and break that streak. He's done it in majors. He's done it against elite level teams, the best in the world. He's done it in best of 3s, in proper playoff series. He's done it in losing efforts. He has done it consistently over a 9-month span now. That's what you have to remember. Remember, it was July of 2016 that we had ESL1 Cologne, and since then to now, barring DreamHack Austin, EliGE has been consistently high level and has been getting better and better, peaking around the end of last year and going off the entire time. He's only had the one bad tournament during that period of time, and look what he's accomplished as a primary carry at that point. Now, you talk about the guy's skill level. Skill is something that immediately leaps off the page with him because he always had streaky skill before that seemed good, but now he's at a point where it's consistently good and it shows up in every game. In that sense, it is kind of like Simple at his prime, kind of like coldzera in terms of the fact that you expected it every match and you seemingly aren't disappointed when their teams are good enough. This is a guy where he has a very good USP. There's a reason why so many of his highlights, even back in the old days, were all USP taps, all quick flick movements between the heads. Obviously, he's famed for playing with a higher sensitivity. It's that wrist control. That's one of the areas where a cornerstone of his game that he built his game upon. But probably his most famous quality, if you've watched him in the past 6 months, is his unbelievable spray control. This guy is really one of those players where you get him at the medium range and it looks like he has no recoil. The bullets just all go where his crosshair is. He controls it there. And as a result, he is ridiculous when he locks on, how he just takes the guy down with consistency. The only player I can really think of at the moment who's kind of doing it like that, it is kind of coldzera. It's the same kind of spray onto them when they're in that position. It's not all on the head and then down Nico style or Simple, but it's just he gets that spray locked on and they basically have like a second to kill him. Otherwise, they are definitely going to die. He is so consistent with it, where that was one of the streaky components before. And people would say, right, well, that's what happens if you have a high sensitivity. Sometimes you'll hit those crazy shots. Reminds me of Exist at the end of 1.6, but not that consistent with it. Now it is incredibly consistent. It is unreal at the mid-range when he has that M4A1, the Silence Colt. And actually, especially when you see him at long range and he does it, can you really see the level of control he has, that it's above even the majority of European players with that weapon. I'd put only a few people in that category. Yes, coldzera, yes, Magisk when he's on form, etc. There's not that many anymore who are capable of that level of incredible spray. A lot of the very skilled players, remember, they tap or they burst, and that's the way they happen to use the gun. Spraying tends to be more in the group of the people who aren't the godlike aimers. Like, I wouldn't say coldzera's a godlike aimer, but he has fantastically refined and consistent spray. Now, Another factor that EliGE has that makes him not just a skilled player, but one of the best in the world, is he has incredibly stable output. That's why this guy puts up ridiculous numbers of frags, and along with it, to show that those frags aren't just like skill frags, or they aren't just like he puts up the most kills, but a lot more kills. The ADR numbers for this guy are also ridiculously high. He puts up huge ADR numbers game after game after game. The consistency and the sheer frequency and output that he's capable of, you really have to go and talk about players like coldzera, like Nico, to get anyone who's close to him in terms of these frags and these ADR numbers. And he's on much worse teams that have less capability to win a game and to go further forwards and to be ahead in the game, where you would think it would make it easier. So he obviously has done it less often than Nico and coldzera over the last year or so, but he's also had fewer occasions to do it. And so for an NA pro, he is absolutely, I mean, it's almost inconceivable that he's doing this right now. I actually think when you look at it, Automatic at his best can't fuck with this guy. He did it for a few tournaments, and some of them were padded. They weren't always against the most elite level teams. Stu2K can't do that. Stu2K can be a fantastic playmaker. In many ways, he's kind of a bit like Config. He's someone who makes the game happen for you, who opens up the game for someone like an Automatic to then clean up for all the kills. But Stu2K can't put out this kind of ADR, cannot put this out of kills consistently, can't control the whole match, can't play in losing efforts and do this, and certainly hasn't done it as much as someone like EliGE has at this point in time. He's someone who, as I mentioned before, he does well in losses. Now, one of the key elements of that is, it's not that he's just baiting everyone or whatever people might want to say, because funnily enough, you could say the same about coldzera when he's at his best. What it is this is a guy where he's now learned his identity as a player, his style of what's going to work for him, and the bounds of his skill set. So he doesn't go outside of those bounds. He doesn't try and make more happen. He stays perfectly within them, and that's how he's consistently putting up these numbers across all the metrics. And so he's a guy where he has that sign of what I call a superstar, which is a good player. When things are going well and he's having a good day and everything's set up perfectly, he can have a good game, he can put up good numbers, and he can say, right, everything was great today. A great player gets his no matter what. Doesn't matter how you're trying to shut him down, doesn't matter how you study him, doesn't matter how badly the game's going, doesn't matter who the opponent is, doesn't matter how badly his teammates are going, doesn't matter, that's not the right day for him, it's not the right map for him, everything's gone poorly up to this point in time. A superstar gets his no matter what. And that's what we've seen with Nico and Mouse Sports, and we've seen with coldzera to some degree just before Luminosity got the really good lineup, and we've seen with some of the other fantastic players when they've been in lesser teams, and now and Kenny S in Titan, and now we're seeing it from EliGE in Liquid, and there's no hyperbole to say that. He really is that good as a player, and he gets his in losses, which is a massive improvement because he was one of the number one people in Team Liquid who used to tilt, who used to fall apart when the game got really tough, and who couldn't always put his numbers up in the big game against those top level teams if we go back a year and a half. I actually think this guy, when I've seen him do it this consistently and for this long and under such trying circumstances and under such difficult circumstances, I really do think that he's someone where the ceiling for him as a player, there is none. The ceiling is be the best player in the entire world from any region, including Europe. That's how good he is as a player. And no NA player before him has actually had that as a ceiling. Because you might say, yeah, but what about when Skadoodle was potentially the number one player with the AWP in the world in the summer of 2015? Sure. But part of the problem was Skadoodle is very much tied to who his in-game leader was and what they were capable of doing with him and how they set him up. And actually, Skadoodle famously never got it done at the majors, never went as deep in the biggest tournaments of all time as someone like EliGE already has. Never got it done ultimately off his own back against so many players and found his own identity and crafted it and learned the boundaries of his skill. A lot of it was tied to how Dazed used him and how Sean Gares used him. He's someone who didn't have the initiative as a player to play at this level, even though skill-wise he absolutely certainly did. And when he was on the right team and on the right path and aimed in the right direction, yes, could be an incredibly good player. But even so, wasn't going to be the best player in the world. At the time, an Olaf Meister was still outside the bounds of what a Skadoodle could do. At the time, even Guardian was a little bit ahead of him. Yes, Kenny S had fallen away. What about a Shroud? He obviously didn't have the mentality to do it. He's someone where he just, whatever his skills were, he couldn't activate them. He's never been able to get his mind on par with what his body could do. Hiko, at one point in time, was an incredibly good player, but he wasn't at the elite level. He wasn't one of the top 5 players in the world. He wasn't someone who who could have potentially been number one and overtaken the Get Right to the Forest of the Dosiers of the world back in 2013. And over time, his style faded away and he couldn't figure out what to do next. Swag not only got banned, but quite frankly wasn't as skilled as EliGE is relative to his peers right now. Swag was very skilled for an NA player at the time, and he certainly had a fantastic sense of who he was as a player, but his ceiling wasn't as high as someone like EliGE is. And I say that as someone who watched Shroud for many years, including those early days, and admittedly, Shroud did do some pretty good stuff in majors. So believe it or not, the crazy thing about this guy now is, it actually turns out after all that, after the Shroud issues, after Swag getting banned, after Skadoodle falling away, after Stu QK appearing, but then having all these issues in terms of being in-game leader, after Max brief period up and then down, it actually turns out the chosen one of NA is fucking EliGE from Team Liquid. It's that guy that you always used to look at and go, actually, you know what, Nitro has a lot of future in him. You know what, we'll see, Hiko's joined the team now. Maybe we could get some other skilled players in, a Tariq or someone like that. But this EliGE guy is probably surplus to requirements. It turns out he's the chosen one after all. And no one could even have seen that, even himself, quite frankly. So the funny thing is, when that whole situation went down, where he was one of the players, the primary ringleader of the idea that they wouldn't keep Simple in Team Liquid after reaching the final of the major, and this ultimatum that it was Simple or him. I mean, at the time, yeah, you looked at it and he was dead wrong. Simple was the much better player. Simple was the force that could take them to a major final. But I have to say, if the notion was that EliGE was saying, essentially, we don't need Simple, I can do that, I can be the Simple, he wasn't wrong in that sense. Even though I'd say Simple ultimately is a more skilled player, because I think it really is a prodigy. I mean, the guy's talent level might be the best to ever play any version of Counter-Strike. But in terms of what he's capable of doing for Team Liquid, EliGE can be a carry on Simple's level. EliGE can be the best NA player and one of the best players in the world, and maybe the best player in the world one day. Who knows? It probably ultimately depends where his team goes. Now, in terms of his style of play, what he had to figure out, as I said, early on, he was in this entry duo with Nitro. And that was the traditional aspect, we thought, a little bit more aggressive, someone who actually had to be more bold in how he went in to encourage Nitro to come in. And depending on the site and the side of the map, they would do that 1-2 punch that Taco and Cold Zero sometimes do, where you never know which one's going quite first, but it depends on the site and the setup. Now, it was that development in late 2015 that activated Nitro to seemingly become the best NA player very briefly and be a very special player that we all look to as this can be the guy who carries the torch for NA. Now, what's interesting is, as EliGE has become the dominant carry, the best NA player, he's backed off a little bit of that aggression, a little bit of that entry aspect. He'll still sometimes go there. And he now has a little bit more of a passive control element to his game. That actually reminds me of Magisk, of Magic's boy, when he was at his prime in the autumn of last year, heading into the winter, where he had fantastic numbers and output, and again, seemed to really know the kind of pace to play the game at. EliGE has moved between the two positions. He's not quite as passive as a Cold Zero or Magisk, but I think he's not quite the aggressive entry, run-in, all-out player that he was when he was trying to get Nitro activated, because he's learned that he is the primary carry, and he has to kind of get his to enable, he has to kind of take care of his position and what he can do and do the best he can do in order to give his team the best chance of winning. He can't just be unselfish as much now, because like many star players, when you're that good, you have to learn to some degree to be selfish in order to be unselfish and help the team, as it were. Now, his personality is obviously something which is contentious, because he's someone where part of the reason early on he never got this bad reputation and nobody really knew outside the team what the issues were is he's a naturally very quiet guy. He's someone who's not going to be the leader. Even if he disagrees with something, doesn't mean he has a better idea initially or wants to be the one taking charge and have everyone listen to him. He just doesn't like the way things are going. Now, the problem is, as we got to 2016, as we got to players like Simple, contentious players in the team, as we had guys like Hiko, who had a very different mentality and comes from the old school, then we start to see this manifest, though, as kind of a stubbornness. Of, yeah, he wants things his way, but that doesn't mean he necessarily knows how things should go. It doesn't mean he knows how he should be coached or how the team should be led. He now knows how he should play. That's a step forwards. But that was something that was contentious itself a year and a half ago, where he still wasn't quite 100% decided himself as a player as to what was going to be his role and what he was going to do entirely, and he was going between these things. So the problem is, that can be a weakness, but it could also be a strength. I mean, it really does go both ways. So when he wasn't this good, yeah, I would say ultimately it was a bad thing. He was too stubborn. He was someone who demanded things be his way too much. He actually did essentially get kicked off the team. Probably he'll be the best player to ever play for that team, simple. Although admittedly EliGE could give him a run for his money perhaps in the future. But I do think now some of that's been channeled into a positive direction because he has blossomed into such a great player and he really has found his own identity and learned what to be able to do as an individual player, to be able to play a way above a level you normally expect from an NA player. I feel like some of that's being channeled into a positive direction there, actually. You have to kind of give him his due there and say, you're right in some of these senses, and some of these things you've turned into positives, and so keep those parts of your game. Don't strip those away thinking you have to be this purely unselfish player and that you can't want things your way. Some of it's working, some of it's going well now. Now, the problem in the past was when things weren't going his way or weren't the way he wanted them to be, and he was stubborn, but he was quiet at the same time, the way these problems would manifest was a very passive-aggressive approach to problems. He's the guy who, when things weren't going his way, he tightens up a bit. And he doesn't say what's on his mind and what he doesn't like and of how it's going. He doesn't say anything at all. And maybe he talks to someone else privately in the team and tells them something he's bothered about, but he doesn't necessarily talk to the person who's the problem, who you could confront and who you could try and fix things with. And he just assumes that they won't understand, or thinks they should someone else's job to do it, or it's their own job to fix things and do what they can do because he's doing what he can do as a player. And he has what at the time was an unproductive mentality in that sense, because this is a guy where you look at that mentality and okay, it's easy to see in a simple where he is entirely aggressive and he's entirely confrontational and he has no patience and he's going to be entirely vocal about what's happening, where the issues are. Now that can be channeled in a positive direction too, to make you a very competitive player, but people don't see it from the other aspect of a guy who just gets quiet and a guy who doesn't tell you what the problem is there, or why he isn't able to do what you asked him to do in the game, or why he doesn't want to do what you asked him to do in the game, or why he thinks you fucked up, but he won't tell you exactly why. That can have its own problems. That can eat away at a player himself. I put it in, I think Pimp mentioned it in some of my interview with him, or maybe it was on the Counterpoints episode, that can be a problem in itself, and you can kind of feel if you're his teammate, like, whereas the simple guy would scream at you and then you'd go, oh, I know I fucked up, but at the same time, that's not an appropriate way to respond to me, and you'd be resentful of that. You can resent the guy where it's like, well, just tell me what the problem is. Oh, you don't want to? Oh, that's not comfortable for you? Well, how are we supposed to fix things as a team? Now, the issue with that, especially in the past, was this led to problems which never got resolved. They only got resolved when people just left the team. That was it. There was no kind of solutions within the squad at the time, and hence we come to some of these examples of ultimatum decisions, or putting yourself in a position where they're going to have to pick you or them. I mean, it's the same as an ultimatum decision, but you see what I mean? Making these conflict points that are just further down the line, unless you don't address the problems. Now, a lot of this is stuff he's working on, and as he becomes a better player, it's going to be less of an issue because people will cater to him. But he's someone where, at the moment, team success is something where it's got to be a riddle that he's trying to figure out. Because until he can get more team success, people aren't going to recognize him as a player, aren't going to see the potential I'm describing here. And I'm talking about potentializing what you're seeing in the game, but just knowing that would happen even in a better team. People are going to look at him like when Stewie2K burst out in Cloud9. And he was a pretty good player in the summer of last year, and he was making big things happen, and people were having to learn, even international players, how to adjust to his style of play. But his team was nowhere near good enough. They were in a position where they weren't even going to make it to the next major. They weren't getting deep runs in tournaments. It wasn't until late in the year they had that one huge tournament performance, which admittedly seems like a one-off now. Yeah, they had good performances before that, but when every time they faced the tier 1 team, they got smashed. And so as a result, team success held Stewie2K back from seeing what the limits of what he could have done would be. You go back, and funnily enough, obviously he was in Team Liquid, you go back and you look at Simple in 2015 when he was in Flipside. He was already a potential top 10 player in the world. His team was nowhere close to being able to take him into majors and go deep. And I mean, at the time he couldn't play in the ESL ones and show off his capabilities, which were incredible, but he had limited chances at lands. And so his team wasn't in a position to elevate him to be the platform where his skills could show off what an incredible player he was. I mean, it's a funny contrast in that sense, because I feel like now, even if EliGE didn't kind of get along with Simple, and he didn't kind of understand the mentality of Simple and that stubbornness and the aggressive nature of Simple, I feel like he should have some sense of some of the problems of what it's like to be the superstar player and not understand what the problems your teammates experiencing are, not understand why they can't get to your level, or understand why they won't just give you everything you need in the game to necessarily dominate, and why they'll criticize you when you're the best player in the team and you're maybe the only one even giving them some of the results they've got. I have to say, you look at EliGE, this guy's better than Stewie, he's better than Automatic, he's better than Mixwell. Right, Mixwell and Stewie 2K, they haven't done it in majors, the things that EliGE has done already. And I'm not just talking about the major where Simple was there, and those two that he was in there. He's done things in the last major where Team Liquid was never going to be a team that made Legend status, but he played like a player who should have been Legend status. Stewie 2K and Mixwell can't say as much as that. None of them have done it for as long as consistently as EliGE has at this higher level. Stewie 2K has ups and downs, and it also depended how far he got in the tournament. If he got to the semi-finals or he's playing against an elite level team, generally it didn't happen for him. He didn't have his fantastic games. He didn't put up bonkers kind of numbers that EliGE can. EliGE has done it in seemingly all circumstances so far. You go and you look at someone like Automatic, yeah, he had a consistent style for a few months, and he had some power for a few tournaments, yeah, for sure. He put up some big numbers, but what happened at the end of it? Well, at the end of all of it, it kind of faded away a bit, and people figured it out, and the rest of the team was good but not good enough, and suddenly he wasn't the monster player anymore, and then he had the bad tournaments, and then suddenly the consistency hasn't quite been there as much. One thing I will say about EliGE is he is in that difficult situation that I think Simple has been in for a few years now, where he can be the best player in his team and he can be the best player in his region, but he might not yet be the most valuable, in as much as beyond just his skills, there are the teammate issues. He hasn't always shown that he makes his teammates better. Now, certainly he's doing his part as an individual player to be the best player he can be, but until he can bridge that gap, until he can figure out some other elements to how to have some leadership, whether that's leadership in the game, like this is the way I play, and imbuing your teammates with confidence as a result of that, that seems like that's where the gap is. That's what he has to cross. That's where he has to transition into an extra element and have an aura around him beyond just being a great player individually, but being a player who improves his team and who helps activate them in some ways. Then maybe his team will be at a level where we'll be able to say, forget NA player, EliGE is the best player in the world.